The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. We're up to Unit 6 in the series, so this is our last unit. So welcome wherever you're tuning in. Looking forward to working with you over the next hour. And our topic today is on the issue of meetings. And the reason why I've included this in the Lunch and Learn series is that if you think about it, our life is just one meeting after the other. So we have, this is a meeting. By the time this is finished, you'll have another meeting to attend, and it goes on and on and on. So if we're attending so many meetings, then as a leader, we've got to become good, I believe, at running meetings. And there are some certain skills that are required to do that. And I think for you, it would be useful for you to take some pride in, the reputation that you have running good meetings. So I think this is very, very important that it's a skill that we should learn. Because let's face it, a lot of the meetings we attend are pretty mediocre. And a lot of them are a waste of our time. And meetings cost serious dollars if you work it out. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on in the webinar. But it costs a lot of money to run a meeting. And so the least we can do as a leader, if we're chairing that meeting, is to become reasonably proficient at running those meetings. I don't think there's a high skill set involved in this. I think it's just a few basic principles that need to be covered. And what I'm hoping to do in this program, in this short session, is really go through a few key things that I know work really well from my own experience, from observation, and also from my own practice as well. So that's the reason why we've included this in the content. So let's get underway. And I think that if you look at the program that we've run through over the last couple of months, we've covered obviously a lot of topics. I won't go through each of the topics because I think they're fairly straightforward now and we've been through them. But I hope that you've had an opportunity to try to use some of the things that you've learned in each of these sessions. So the whole idea is to apply, one or two key principles in each of these areas to improve your ability to lead people. And obviously some of the topics would have resonated more with you than others, but I'm hoping that you could see the relevance of all the topics that we've covered. So this is our last session, as I mentioned. So let's just do a quick recap of what we did 2 weeks ago. We ran a session on understanding people and their personalities, and basically you were to complete a diagnostic and really consider your own personality predisposition, and then to perhaps look at the people around you and start to lead with an emphasis on their personality type. Because I think the big mistake all of us make is that we tend to treat people how we want to be treated, which of course is what I mentioned last time is the golden rule, but the platinum rule is more effective in terms of leadership, and that is treat people how they want to be treated. And everyone's got their own motivation that we've gone through, and if you can tap into that motivation, you'll find that you'll get much better results in terms of connection and engagement from other people. So essentially that's what the homework was. And as I mentioned, it's all about treating people how they want to be treated rather than treating people how you want to be treated. So I hope you had a bit of fun with that. I hope you had a good look around your work area, and I hope that you've been able to look carefully at that. Of course, you've got the diagnostic. There's no reason why you can't use that as a useful training session with some of your team members to have a bit of a laugh, diffuse some misunderstandings, and perhaps improve the capacity to engage with the team. So I hope you've had some fun with that. But of course, there's a serious message in all of that, essentially. So what we're going to cover over the next 50 odd minutes is we're going to look at the context of meetings. So what sort of meetings are there that you may be engaged in or you may chair? Let's have a look at the different types of meetings there are. Let's look at the structure of meetings and how they should be set up, and what would be some practical things that you can do in that regard. There are obviously some interpersonal and leadership skills that are required in order to run a meeting effectively, and we'll look at those as we go. And I'll give you at the end some ideas to how you might enrich your meetings and make them even more effective. And they're very simple to implement and have a huge impact in terms of getting other people involved and engaged. So that's what we're going to be covering over the next short time. Now, one of the things that we should be aware of here is that getting good at running productive meetings is one of the most critical, I think, and untapped skills of any leader. So as you progress in your career journey, and assuming, of course, you want to continue in that leadership space, you'll be required to run more and more meetings. You'll be required to attend more and more meetings. And so it is important to become good at this skill, because if you work out, for example, it's Friday. Now, if you worked out how many hours this week you spent in meetings, you might be very surprised. You know, it might actually be worthwhile you doing that and just going back over your diary and having a look at the number of hours you've spent in meetings. So, and then you might look at the number of hours of meetings that you chair. So it's significant, but it's not just the hour a meeting might take. It's the fact that if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 people in the meeting, then it's not really 1 hour, is it? It's really 5 hours if it's 5 people. And it's not just 5 hours, it's actually 10 hours if you've got 5 people, because while they're in the meeting, of course, they can't be attending to the other tasks that they're required to do. So that's when I say it's a costly exercise, that's why. So it's actually 10 hours of productive time that's taken up in a 1 hour meeting with 5 people. So it's significant. So we want to make sure that we get the best value from those meetings as such. Now, the other insight I would give you is this, that meetings themselves are not productive in the sense that it's what happens or doesn't happen between the meetings that determines the effectiveness of the meeting. So meetings are really an organisational point where we can start to marshal tasks and resources to people to get things done. Obviously, if nothing gets done between the meetings, then the meetings themselves are not being very productive. So think about it as in the meetings themselves are an exchange of ideas, conveying of information, alignment of viewpoint. All of those things obviously are important, but at the end of the day, it's what happens between the meetings that's critically important. It's a little bit like the Lunch and Learn series. You might be enjoying or have enjoyed the series, but the real question is, what have you done as a result of being involved with me for 6 hours? What have you actually tried to implement differently? What have you decided to do, or what have you decided not to do as a result of our time together? That's the true measure of the value of our meetings, which in this case is the Lunch and Learn series. So it might be something to think about. It's not really what the meetings are about, it's what happens between the meetings that's critically important. So there's a range of different reasons for having meetings. So let's just run through these. Now, obviously, many of these things are merged. So, it's not necessarily that you could dedicate one meeting to one of these topics over on the bottom left-hand corner. But if you break meetings down and you consider meetings, there are meetings to inform people. So this might be a new change of direction in the business. This might be a new change in the team. It could be to brief people about a senior management meeting. So yes, information is very important. So meetings are a way of conveying information. They could be also to educate people. So a training workshop, or what we're doing today, or those kinds of things could definitely be an education opportunity. So, for example, if you've got a new product or a new service that's being introduced into the business, and you've got a meeting around some training around how that product and service will be implemented and some of its features and benefits, then it's obviously an education meeting. You've got meetings around clarification. So, for example, if there's been a crisis in the organisation and you want to debrief on that crisis, it may well be that it's around clarifying roles and responsibilities. Who's involved with what? Who makes decisions? How are those decisions made? So clarifying meetings, or clarifying people's expectations in meetings, can be a reason for having a meeting. It could also be around it could also be around engaging. So it could be about getting your team engaged in a new direction or a new approach, which is more of a kind of a motivational meeting, where you're getting people to be on the same page essentially, but to have them engage both their hearts and minds. So there is space for that in meetings. Meetings could also be there to collectively solve problems. So there could be a problem that's occurring in your team that requires an answer, and you may not have the answer, but you want to extract the ideas from your team and how you might resolve that particular problem in the future. So the meeting could very much be a process of collective problem solving, which is facilitation, where you'd probably do less talking and more listening, but you'd make sure that you were keeping the meeting on track around the actual solution to a particular problem. Meetings are also there to review progress. Now, I think we spend too much time doing this in meetings. Most people have a work in progress meeting each week, either to review what has happened over the past week or perhaps to plan for the next week. Now, I say too much of this. Of course, some of it's important. We do need to know what's going on. We do need to know what project people are working on. We do need to know what decisions have been made, what clients have been discussed, and so forth. Of course, we need to do that. I just think that sometimes we spend too long and sometimes just dedicate our meetings just to that, to review progress. So my challenge for you is to shorten some of the reporting back processes to the key performance indicators, and to create a space to be doing some of the other things that I think can be very, very meaningful and relevant to your team. And of course, meetings are there to make decisions. So you can make decisions and gain consensus from a meeting, and that in itself can be very useful when you've got everyone sitting around the table agreeing on a particular course of action. So you can see that there are a lot of reasons that we meet. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these things merge into others. So your meeting could be a hybrid version of any of these particular possibilities. But my challenge for you is to try and steer further away from the reviewing progress type meeting to incorporate some of the other possibilities that are on this page. So that's the meeting. Now let's have a look at the costs of meetings. Now I've sort of alluded to this earlier, but I just want you to, I really want you to have a think about the costs of running meetings in your organisation. Now, I know in the Lunch and Learn series, we've got people in, everyone from one-person shows right through to large corporations. So it really depends on the size of the organisation in terms of the cost, the dollar cost for these meetings. But I just wanted to alert you to how costly it is to run meetings. So if you do a little exercise like this, and it might well be worth doing this exercise, the first question you'd need to ask yourself is, what's the average income of your team? Now, you work this out on an hourly rate. So it's pretty simple to do. You just divide by, you divide a person's income, so you can work out what the average hourly rate is of the people sitting in your team meetings. And then the next question is, how many meetings on average, do your team members attend a week? They may not all be meetings with you, of course. They could be meetings with other stakeholders in the business. But that's not hard to work out either. You could just do an audit on that and ask people to come to a meeting with you, having given you some indication of how many hours a week they spend in meetings. You'll be quite surprised at how extensive that is. That also includes impromptu meetings. These are not just set meetings, these are meetings of any shape, description. And then, of course, how long do these meetings run for? There's a conventional wisdom that a meeting should run for about an hour, but of course many meetings run over that time and a few run under that time. So just giving some indication of how long each of these meetings lasts. How many people are there in your team? And the other question that you need to ask are, what are the opportunity costs? Now, what I mean by opportunity costs, if you're not familiar with that term, is that while people are sitting in meetings, assuming, of course, they're giving undivided attention to the meeting itself, they can't really be doing anything else. So in other words, if I spend an hour in a meeting, it's actually costing me 2 hours of my time. Of course, the hour is sitting there in the meeting, but the other hour to account for is the fact that I'm not doing something else that perhaps is related to my key performance indicators. So in other words, when we work out these numbers, we actually need to double them because obviously people aren't able to do other things. So you can see that there's a few questions there that are not too difficult to answer. And I mean, it's a good idea for you to do it yourself. But if you're really wanting to do some good work in your team around meetings, then you might want to do this with your team as well. So let's look at some figures. Let's assume that the hourly rate of your team, when it's all worked out, average hourly rate is about $31.25. Let's assume that's the hourly rate. Let's assume that each person in your team has 5 meetings per week. Now, these are very conservative figures, and I just want to make a really important point about the cost of meetings here, but let's assume that each person attends about 5 meetings a week. Now, let's assume that each of those meetings are typically about 2 hours long. So if you take a 40-hour week, for example, that means that 10 hours of that week is absorbed in meetings. That's actually not an unrealistic number, I might say. If you look at it and go back over your calendar over the last week, I'd be surprised if you were spending less than 10 hours a week in a meeting. It'd be probably an extraordinary week. So let's assume in your team that you have 6 people. And so that's including yourself. So let's say you've got a team of 6 and you're accounting for yourself as well as everybody else in the team. And the opportunity costs are, we're going to double, as I said, the cost of those figures so that we can actually look at what it's costing your team on a weekly basis to attend meetings, whether it's your meetings, other stakeholders' meetings, or whatever the meetings are. All right, so let's put some figures on that. Now, if we work on the basis of 6 people, that gives you, if you work on the figures that I've given you there, that actually works out to be, over the course of a year, $195,000 a year. That's what it's costing you in your team to attend meetings. $195,000 a year to attend meetings using the figures that I've given you. So that's quite significant. Now, I'm not suggesting that we need, that $195,000 is wasted. But what I would say to you that if it is $195,000, which it is based on these figures, then I would suspect that you'd be wanting to get some reasonable value for attending those meetings. So if we take that further and we consider that there's 1,000 people in an organisation, let's talk about a corporation, 1,000 people who basically are, are reflective of the numbers that I've given you at the bottom. That figure annually works out to be $32.5 million. Now, if you were an accountant, and I know some of you are, if you were an accountant and you were sitting down at the end of the financial year and you were looking at the expenditure, and this was a line item in your budget. So there was a line item that just simply said meetings, $32.5 million. Now, I suspect that as an accountant, you would probably question that figure and say, well, what was this $32.5 million for? And did we actually get value for money from this $32.5 million investment in meetings? Of course, we don't do that, do we? We just kind of just go with the flow and attend meetings and so forth. But essentially, I just wanted to alert you to the cost for running these sorts of meetings, quite significant. So when I say to you at the beginning that meetings are costly, you can understand now what I'm getting at. So the question then is, can we be more efficient and effective in how we actually conduct our meetings? And I guess the answer to that question is yes. And my job is to give you some answers around how you might do that. Now, here are some tips that I strongly recommend that you consider when you're going through your process of meetings. And here are some things that you might like to consider. There is a conventional wisdom that it's a good idea to rotate the chair. So the idea is, of course, that you don't chair every meeting, that each person in your team has an opportunity to chair the meeting. I think this is bad practice. And I think it's bad practice for a couple of reasons. I think firstly, as the leader of your team, you're the one who has the responsibility for running the meetings. So essentially, it should be a key performance indicator for you. And so I think everyone has an expectation that you'll do that. And I think you should have an expectation that that's your job. And so one of the things that I strongly recommend is you hone your skills in doing that. Another reason why it's not a good idea is that everyone dreads their opportunity to chair the meeting. The stress levels rise, people dread the opportunity, so it doesn't really contribute much to participation, which is essentially what you're trying to do, because people don't want to be doing it. So all they're worried about is whether they're doing it right, and so that in itself creates a problem. The third reason why this isn't a good idea is that people, because they only do it once in a blue moon, are actually not particularly good at it. And so you have a series of mediocre meetings while each person displays a minimum acceptable standard of presentation and facilitation and and chairing the meeting. So, there's a lot of reasons I think that you should be running the meetings. I don't think it really is a good idea to do that. So if you have rotated, I'm interested to hear your feedback about that too, by the way. But if you are rotating the chair, perhaps you might like to think, hopefully out of a result of this webinar, that you may decide to take back the ownership of that task in your meeting, because I think that's pretty much a core task of what a leader should do. You may disagree with me, but my personal view is it is your job to do that. Now, another thing that I think is very important in your meetings is that you should try as much as you possibly can to balance reporting and discussion. I think too many meetings are actually around reporting. Now, of course, you've got to have some reporting, and I'm not suggesting you don't. But if your whole meeting is absorbed with reporting, then I think you'll find that people will get bored and disengage pretty quickly. In other words, they'll be engaged when they're giving their report, but perhaps not so engaged when other people around the table are giving their report. So my suggestion is reduce the reporting time to some key performance indicators and create a space to have more discussion. And you might say, well, what am I going to discuss? There's a whole range and raft of things that you can discuss, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the important thing is the ideal meeting should be 50% reporting and 50% discussion. Not exactly, but pretty much the case, and it could vary depending on the meeting and what's happening at the time. But what you're trying to do is to engage people during the meeting. And the only way you can engage anyone truly is through discussion. So it's important to actually think about how you might do that more effectively. So that's a principle I think you should think about as well. Now, another principle is that when you're in your meetings, what you should do is use critical incidents. In other words, examples of positive or negative events that have occurred that are an opportunity for learning. So, for example, if there's something that went wrong between, the last meeting and this meeting, then I strongly recommend that that would be put on the agenda for discussion. And the discussion is not about finger pointing and who was to blame and all the rest of it. Set a ground rule about that. The discussion is really how could we have done this better, faster, easier, safer, more efficiently, more effectively. So you can have a discussion about that. But don't neglect the good things as well. There's probably been some really positive things that happen that are critical incidents between meetings. And if something that's happened that's really positive, then why not put that on the table? And the question then is, how can we all agree on a particular course of action for future meetings based on this good example that happened since the last meeting? So critical incidents are very powerful because they're real. They're usually current. In other words, they've only just happened. And so really, they're as realistic as you can get. But I find that leaders often balk at this because they're worried about people pointing fingers of blame or avoiding responsibility and all the rest of it. So my suggestion is during a meeting, you start by saying, I'd like to talk about the event that happened yesterday, but I want to talk to it from the perspective of what we can learn from it. And I really don't want to hear any, blame or, passing the buck or anything like that. I want to hear how we might be able to have capitalised on that and done it better. So I set the ground rule, and if anybody just starts down the track of criticising somebody else during that meeting, I would simply and politely stop them and say, remember what the ground rule was. This is about us learning as a team. It's not about us pointing fingers of blame at anybody else. So I think that will work very well for you, and that could be part of your discussion in that 50% that I referred to before. Now, the other thing that I think is sadly neglected in meetings is that people make the assumption that everybody understands their role in the team. Now, you understand everyone's role in the team because you're the leader, but does everyone else around the table understand the roles that everyone else plays in the team? I suspect not as well as you would like. And one of the things that I strongly recommend that you do, particularly if you've got a multidisciplinary team, is to get people at different times to give a brief presentation in your meetings about perhaps some of the challenges and opportunities they have in their role. And perhaps another focus could be on how other people in the team could assist them with that problem or challenge or opportunity. So in other words, don't assume that people know what you do. They don't. They think they know, but they don't know because you're the only one that really knows what goes on in your team. So how can you clarify roles? The other thing that you can do, of course, is that you can get other people to attend your meeting as a guest speaker, not in any formal sense, but just to come in and to clarify what they do and how you might be able to assist them with that and what they can do to assist you and your team. That can be very, very useful and a far better use of your time than just a mindless reporting process. So clarifying roles is very, very important. One of the key things that I often do with groups of people is I'll actually ask them this question at the beginning of a meeting, and you might like to try this. I say to people, you've only got one sentence to express this, but what is the main purpose of your role? Now, let's assume you've got a whole lot of customer service officers in your meeting. So you're the head of the customer services team, and you go around the table and you ask each person to express in one sentence, give them time to think about it, in one sentence what their core responsibility is. Now, this is very interesting. You'll probably find that even though they're all doing the same job, that you'll have different variations in terms of what they think they should be doing. Therein lies a very interesting observation, that if everyone's not saying similar things, not exact words of course, then what's happening is that that could well explain why there are frustrations around priorities and so forth. I'll give you an example. I worked with a bunch of managers not long ago, and I asked them the question, what's your core responsibility? And we went around the table. We had 7 people in this team. They were all managers, and not one of them in the whole 7 presentations mentioned the fact that they were leading people. Not one. It was all about the product. It was all about the service delivery. Absolutely no comment whatsoever about the leadership component of what they did. And of course, I could then very gently but poignantly point out to people at the end of those presentations that nobody mentioned people, and you could hear a pin drop when I mentioned that. In other words, this team was criticised very much for not demonstrating real leadership, getting the best out of people and so forth, many of the things that we've done in the Lunch and Learn series. But it was a great opportunity for me to then point out to the team that I didn't hear anything about that. And of course, that gave people a chance to think a little bit more deeply about what their role was. So this work is hugely underestimated, but very, very important. So take time to clarify roles in team meetings. Now, not all of you can do this, but another possibility could be that you could use standing meetings, and this is particularly relevant in a production area. So standing meetings are great because when you have a standing meeting, because we're standing, people will tend to get to the point much quicker. People will be a bit more alert, and you'll actually find that the meetings can be very effective if we're standing rather than seated. Now, in an office environment, it'll look a bit funny to do that, I guess, but in some cases it might be very relevant. But a standing meeting means that you'll reduce the time that the meeting takes, you'll increase the engagement, and people will get to the point a lot quicker. So standing meetings can be very effective for that reason. So, for example, in a production area where you might have a meeting as a transition between shifts, so a new shift is starting, the old shift is finished, a standing meeting would be ideal in those circumstances, where you could get a briefing about what's happened in the previous shift and how that's going to impact on the next shift, and you could have both shifts there at the time. So this could be a 5-minute stand-up meeting around issues that have occurred during the last shift and how that might impact on the next shift, if at all. So standing meetings can be very effective as well. Now, if it's worth having a meeting, it's worth having an agenda. Now, obviously, in an impromptu meeting, there's no point in having an agenda because you've just decided to meet right there on the spot. So you clearly wouldn't have an agenda, although you would, but it's just not written down. But for your normal meetings, you should have an agenda. And what I mean by that is a written agenda. Now, it's courtesy to the people attending. As I said, it's costly, but it also means that you've done some planning, you've done some thought around what's on the agenda. You can also invite people to add to the agenda. And so the agenda is a live plan, if you like, about what we'll cover in the meeting. Now, I strongly urge you not to have a line item at the end of the agenda called general business. If you have an item at the end called general business, what will happen is that general business will become the dominant topic on the agenda. So in other words, people will just think on the spur of the moment and think, oh yes, I've got something I wanted to add, or I've got a comment I'd like to make about such and such. Now, so what we want people to do is to contact you prior to the meeting and to insert that concern or item on the agenda so that it is part of the agenda. So there's nothing to stop you, of course, at the end of the meeting going around the table, anything to add. But if you have this righto general business type approach at the end of a meeting, you'll find that that will soak up a lot of time while people are off parroting their pet projects or concerns. So don't do it that way. The other thing I'd say about agendas is that conventional wisdom suggests that the most important items come first and the least important items come last. And the reason for that is that obviously if you run out of time in your meeting, and you shouldn't run over schedule, but if you run out of time, then the things that are left off the agenda will hopefully be less important than the things that were at the beginning of the agenda. And of course, people's energy level is high at the beginning of a meeting, and it just starts to dissipate as the meeting continues. So the idea is to have the important items first on the agenda. And it's your job as the team leader or the leader to work out what those items might be and when you're going to discuss them. The other tip I'd give you in running meetings, it's highly effective, is at the end of each item, have a little number. So you put down a bracket and a number in it and a closer bracket. And that number should be the amount of time that's going to be spent on that item. So, for example, you might have reports, and then you might have 10 in brackets there. The 10 indicates that you've got 10 minutes for everybody to report back on their key items. So if somebody's dragging the chain or they're taking too long to get to the point, you can very easily and respectfully say to that person, can you get to the point, because we've only got 10 minutes on this item, as you can see on the agenda. So that's a way of helping you control the flow of the meeting. And I think it works extremely well, and it forces you to think carefully about how long each item should take in its discussion. So you're doing a bit of planning before the meeting. It doesn't take long to do, but it's quite important. Now, you can always go over time if it's important, but it does give you the authority to actually say to people, we need to move on because we've only allocated 10 minutes to this. The other thing I'd probably suggest to you in terms of timeliness of meetings is instead of saying that your meeting will start at 9 o'clock or even 8:30 or whatever it might be, use a strange time like 8:45 or 9:15. Why? Because the implication is that that's a sharp starting time, and it sends a very strong signal to the rest of the team that that's the time we start the meeting, and it's a lot more effective than to just have a round figure like 10 a.m. Now, the other thing is, of course, you'll always have your latecomers to meetings, and the very important thing to do here is to start your meetings on time and to finish on time, because it's respectful. If you start on time and you finish on time, you are respecting the busy schedules of your team members who have many, many things to do and plan. And if it's sort of a loose arrangement about the time you start and finish, then people will get annoyed about that because they aren't able to plan other things. So what often happens with these is that the leader will sit at the head of the table, and because there are two people late to the meeting, the leader will often say, oh, we'll just wait a few minutes for John and Mary to arrive. And then when John and Mary arrives, of course, you start. But all you're actually doing, without even realizing it, is you are actually rewarding John and Mary for being late. In other words, their self-importance is such that, we can't really start a meeting without them being there. Just start the meeting, because walking into a meeting while it's already started can, for some, most hopefully, be an embarrassing scenario. So just start on time and, of course, finish on time. And that's if you've itemised your agendas from most important to least important, then it's not a problem leaving things off the agenda that can be covered in the following meeting. So it's important to do those things and to do them right. And, of course, as I mentioned earlier, try and get some feedback from people around what goes in the agenda items. Now, what I suggest you do, another skill that can be very, very effective, is that you summarise at the end of the meeting. Now, I don't think you should do that if you're running the meeting. I would get someone else to do that in your team that's got a bit of a knack at being able to, sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So I'm sure you've got somebody in your meeting, and if you look at the personality styles that I mentioned a fortnight ago, you're probably looking at an owl. An owl will be able to be very detail focused and be able to work out what the details are. And you actually delegate the responsibility for them to just simply summarise the key points that came out of the meeting. Now, this isn't about, minute taking. That can be useful, but this is really leaving everyone clear at the end of the meeting what the key points were in the meeting that came out. Now, this is not just repeating the agenda, but these are the key decisions and the key touch points that have occurred throughout the meeting. And if you find the right person with the right personality, they will relish that opportunity and probably do a better job at it than you would. But so delegate that responsibility to someone else, and you'll find that everyone walks away from the meeting with some very clear indicators of the key messages that have come out of the meeting. So that works really well for you. As I mentioned earlier, your meeting effectiveness will drop. So at the beginning, over on the left-hand side, you've probably got, reasonably high energy levels, and that will build for a period of time. And then, of course, it'll drop off quite dramatically. So this is a reason why it's critically important to have your key things on your agenda item early in the meeting. So where there's got to be decisions made, normally that should be early on in the meeting, and then you can have your reports and all the rest later on in the meeting. But where you want to make some thoughtful decisions in a meeting, do them early in the meeting, not late in the meeting, and you'll find that you'll get them done a lot quicker and probably better as a result of that. I think 1 hour meetings are a good rule of thumb. If you can't cover something in an hour, then that's problematic. I think if your meetings go for longer than an hour, they're too long. Half an hour's probably too short, but an hour and a half is probably too long. I think an hour's about right, and I think that's a reasonable time frame, notwithstanding what I said about the costs of meetings as well and all the rest of it. So go for an hour a meeting, which is probably fairly reasonable, and stick to that hour, making sure you start on time and finish on time. Now, another thing that you might like to think about, and it's often underestimated, is that the setup of the room is going to dictate the quality of the meeting. Now, you're not going to use all of these configurations you can see on your screen, perhaps, but I just wanted to share with you these 6 configurations, because each of them in their own way will impact on the nature of the meeting, and there are certain meetings that require this. So if you start at the top left-hand corner, we've got the theatre style, where we've got everyone sitting in rows, you can see there, and you've got a head table, and you've got several key players sitting at the head table. Now, this is an information sharing type scenario where the people at the head table will probably be sharing information with the rest of the group. So it's quite a formal setting, obviously. So a shareholder meeting, for example, would be set up very much like this. And each of those 4 people would probably give a presentation, and the rest of the audience is probably reasonably passive in this arrangement. They can ask questions if they want, but it's going to be a fairly one-way type of meeting where it's an information giving meeting. Going clockwise and looking at the classroom arrangement there, the difference between the classroom arrangement and the theatre style is you can see that people are now have desks, and what that does is it gives people a chance, of course, to write down information. So this could be, for example, information, but more information around education. So you've got opportunities there for people to actually take notes and to or type on their laptop. So those, again, that style, which is the classroom style, is not ideal for sharing of information. This is good for conveying information, but not necessarily sharing. A much better arrangement for sharing is the U shape that's on the right-hand side there at the top. The U shape is great because people, most of them at least, are facing each other. So people that often attend training programs often set the room up in a U shape. And the U shape is great because it can precipitate some discussion between the various participants in the meeting. So the U shape creates this synergy, and people can talk about things across the table and so forth. There's still desks there so people can take notes. So this is an ideal scenario in a training workshop. Now, going to the bottom left-hand side, you've got the conference style where people are sitting around a conference table. So a boardroom, those kinds of things. This is great as well for communication with various participants in the team. So this improves communication. People are in closer quarters. People can see each other across the table. You might sit at the head of the table, and what you're doing is you're creating a conversation across the table between various players in the team. The next one going to the right there is the banquet style, and this is normally for a formal dinner or something like that, where you'd have people sitting at tables in groups. So the person organising this meeting can decide what those groupings are. And there might be a common thread like different functions or whatever, different teams, and that those people can then convey and share. So that's a little more social. The one that I really like is the last one, which is what we call the cabaret style, or sometimes we call it the cafeteria style in Australia, where we have small groups of people sitting around a table. Now, this is the best for larger groups where you want some interaction at different times, where people can talk to each other at each table and perhaps report back. So it's quite effective. So think carefully about the style of seating and what sort of style of seating you have for your meetings, and think carefully about how you can set up the room to be more effective as such. Now, I don't think this is very utilised, but I think it's very important for you to, at different times, get guest speakers to come in and address your team. Now, they don't have to be, I'm not talking about, $5,000 an hour type speakers or anything like that. I'm talking about other people either in your team or outside your team. So people within your team. So, for example, someone in your team might have attended a conference. Well, there's the perfect opportunity for them to report back on what they got from the conference and what some of the key points were and how those points may impact on the team's workings in the future. Great opportunity. What about if you've got someone inside your organisation who you would like to invite to the meeting to share with the team a particular perspective or a function of what they do in the team? That's great. Now, you don't have to dominate the whole meeting with the guest speaker. You could actually have them literally present for 5 minutes on key points, and they could be invited to leave the meeting as soon as they've finished. So this can be very good. Invite your CEO to the meeting. perhaps there's somebody in another area of the business that you feel would be able to educate your people a little bit more effectively on, what they do. So try to use guest speakers. It can be very effective, and it can broaden people's insights into various functionings and things that go on inside the organisation where you've got relatively large organisations. If it's possible, you can bring people from outside as well who might be prepared to do that. You may have to pay them, but in a lot of cases, if you do it the right way, you won't need to do that, particularly if it's a short, sharp presentation. They don't have to do an elaborate PowerPoint or anything like that unless they want to. It might just be for them talking to a few notes that they've written down prior to the meeting. So think about applying that in your own workspace. Now, a couple of skills that you should try to adhere to as interpersonal skills when you're chairing these meetings. Paraphrasing is one of the most powerful tools that you can use. Now, what paraphrasing simply means is that when someone's made a point in your meeting, you simply, in your own words, basically regurgitate back what you've heard. So you usually would start this by, so in other words, what you're saying is that you didn't receive the right information so that you could get the report in at the right time. Now, they might have spent 5 minutes talking about that, but essentially that was the key message. Now, that serves three purposes, three useful purposes. One of the purposes of doing that is to make sure, that is by checking to make sure that you have an understanding of what the speaker's point is. All right, by doing that, you're checking to make sure that you've got the key point. Now, that's a good thing to do. The second reason that you would do that is to let the speaker know that you've heard them. So it lets the speaker know that you've actually heard them. Now, that's not a bad thing. So if you're chairing the meeting and you've said, in other words, you're telling me that you didn't get the right information at the right time, and that's why the report was in late, what you've done is you've distilled down the key point, and the speaker knows that you know, and that's the important thing. The third reason, and perhaps the one that's not considered quite readily, is you can move the meeting on, because once you've paraphrased what someone said, you're in control. So after you've paraphrased and you've got a nod of assurance or a smile or something from the person that's made the comment, you can then move the meeting on to the next agenda item gracefully without having to worry about other comments being made. So it's a very powerful way of being able to also, when you've got verbose people in your team, shut them up. So once they draw breath, you can say, so in other words, blah, 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 and you've got the key message, and of course you can move on from there. So paraphrasing is one of the best tools that you can use when you're running a meeting in your own area. Now, how do we get people involved in meetings? Well, the best way to get people involved in meetings is to ask them for their opinion. Now, I find that, if you look at your team, you've got, and we've talked about personalities, you've got extroverts, you've got introverts. Now, extroverts will probably dominate the meetings, introverts will probably not say enough. So you've got your quiet ones and you've got your dominant ones. Now, your job is to manage that. It's not about you just passively sitting there and allowing the dominant characters to run the meeting, because people will be offended by that. Certainly not the ones that are being verbose, but the other ones in the team will. So at some point, you should, and this works very well, is when someone's sitting there quietly and saying nothing, actually defer to them. So you actually say, John or Mary, have you got anything you want to add to what's already been said? Now, John and Mary might say, no, I don't. That's fine. At least John and Mary have been invited to make a comment. Now, that's not where it ends. Not only does John and Mary know that they're expected to contribute in the meeting because you've asked them if they've got an opinion, but the other quiet ones in the team would also think to themselves, hang on, if I don't say something here, my manager or my leader is going to actually ask me for my opinion. So it's a very good way of getting people engaged. Now, you're not embarrassing people because they've got a way out. They can say, no, I don't have anything I've got to add. So that's easy. But if they do have something to add, and you find this will happen quite a lot, then they have an opportunity to contribute that way. So that's the best way to get people involved. You might also use a team values charter, and so this galvanizes the team, and this could be one of your discussion points. And you might, this comes from one of my books, where you've essentially got 5 questions you ask people. You actually get them to write down the answers to these 5 questions. So they bring a pen and a pad with them, or their laptop or iPad or whatever they're going to use, and you ask them, what's the one value that's important to you when we meet? So what we're trying to do is to create a values charter in our team. So I might say respect. And then I might say, well, what does it mean to you? And I might say, well, respect means to me that I'm listened to and my point of view is taken into account. 3 is, why is it important? Now, I might say respect's important to me because I want to believe that I have something to contribute of value in this team. 5, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? Well, where people are giving me an opportunity to finish what I'm saying before interrupting me. And of course the opposite's true. What behaviours would violate that is people are interrupting me and making assumptions about what they think I'm going to say. You get everyone to write those answers down, and then what you do is you go around the table and you get people to articulate the answers to these 5 questions. And out of that you form a team values charter, which is a charter about how you'll operate as a team. And you'll find this is enormously effective. And it'll only take you 15 to 20 minutes to do, and it can be a really important framework for you to keep people true to their own commitments around teamwork. So you might like to have a look at that a little later and think about whether you could use that. Now, finally, what I strongly recommend that you do is, and I just don't get why people don't do enough of this, start your meetings with a win for the week. Now, you can call it whatever you like, win for the week, whatever, but you go around the table and you ask people to tell you one positive thing that's happened during the last week, assuming, of course, you meet weekly, fortnightly, same thing. And when you do this initially, everyone will be stumped because they'll have nothing to say, which is kind of sad, isn't it? Because people think that meetings are all about talking about problems. Well, they are to some extent. But why don't we balance it up by just going around the table and asking people to share a win for the week? Now, that win for the week could be a work-related win, or it could be a personal situation. It doesn't really matter. But you will actually create what we call an upward spiral of positivity by doing this. And, of course, we're going to talk about all the problems later on, so why don't we start with a win for the week? It's so simple. And it gives you a tremendous insight into people. And you'll find after 2 or 3 meetings of doing a win for the week, you'll find that people cannot wait to get to the meeting to share with you their win for the week. They'll have thought about it, so they're on a positive upward spiral, and they'll come to the meeting expecting to be able to share that. So you might want to consider that as well. All right, so that brings us to the end, and what I would say to you now is that your job now is to implement some new approaches to meetings. I've given you plenty of information there to share, and what I would strongly recommend that you do is you start to think about some things that you can do that will make a difference. So you might just introduce win for the week, or you might consider the cost of meetings, or you might consider making sure that you take back the chair role of running the meeting. So that's something that you might like to consider. But I really want you to try and improve the quality of your meetings, not just for you, but for everybody else who's going through the meetings. So, folks, that brings us to the end of the Lunch and Learn. And sorry, I've got the wrong date there on the screen, I notice. I hadn't changed that. But I've got another Lunch and Learn that's starting in January next year. So if there's somebody in your organisation that might be interested in doing going through the journey that you've gone through, by all means, get in touch with me because I'll be happy to sort of get them enrolled and all the rest of it. So we've gone through 6 topics, and I guess, the topics that are there actually in front of you, I should say, are what the next series will be about. So, of course, you can choose to do another series if you like as well, but there'll be different topics. This is more around high-performing teams. So you might want to consider doing another series if you'd like. That's up to you. So, folks, that brings us pretty much to an end, and I guess I just wanted to thank each of you for working with me over the course of the several months that we've been working together. I hope you found it useful and worthwhile, and I hope you've been able to implement something that's been of effect for you and made a difference. So we'll pretty much bring it to an end. If you've got some feedback about the Lunch and Learn, drop me an email. You've got all my details, and let me know what you got out of the program, or whether you think there's things I can do to improve it or whatever. More than happy to listen to any of those comments. So that'll bring us to the end, and so thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for your involvement in the Lunch and Learn, and maybe our paths will cross sometime in the future. We'll see how we go. Thank you, and goodbye.